Okie doke, we're recording. This is Kubernetes SIG Network from May 14th, 2020. Tim, take it away with some issue triage.
Excellent. Let me share screen. Host disable attendee shares screen sharing.
Let's see if I can.
Mother may I.
I made you co-host, Tim, so you should be able to share now.
Rock and roll. Let's do a window and this one. Make sure I get the right one.
We can see it. Yep.
All right. So I loaded up. Let's go to the individuals. So this is starting newest. In fact, this one's so new that Athena hasn't even gotten there yet. Kubernetes managed.
Javier.
Sorry?
Sorry, I was late. I don't know if you already tried to talk about FQDN, but I was having issue with internet.
No, Javier, we usually do 15 minutes of triage first, and then we get into agenda. So hang
perfect.
tight, and I saw you on the agenda. And I also saw your issue as I was opening them up. Kubernetes manage pods host file. Kubernetes manage host file not in sync with node for host network pods.
I don't think we synchronize the host file.
I don't think so either. I think it's copied in, not linked in, right?
Yeah.
Cal, can I assign this one to you?
Yeah.
Is it copied in every time a pod is started?
I think it's bind mounted in when the pod is started from a copy. Because we can't use the, oh wait, this is in host network. I don't know, we'll have to go look at it. I'm gonna give it to Cal.
Yeah.
Well, host network wouldn't make a difference here, right?
Well, in non-host network, we edit it so that we can add our own stuff. So obviously we're making a copy, right? I'm not sure in host network if we make a copy or not. I suspect we are. Okay, next. Print more details like path, termination to kubectl get, ingress, output. This is.
Does get ingress have an O wide?
Probably not.
You can assign this to me if you want. It's a feature request, I would imagine.
Yeah, I'm going to remove the triage, leave it as a feature. I'll assign it to you, but it doesn't sound like it's, whoops, I can't talk and type. Doesn't sound like it's super high urgency, so cool. Allow setting, this is Javier, so we'll just table this for now. Internal error curl, failing calling webhook. I don't think this is us.
I think that Jordan solved this.
Oh. Excellent. Testing NIC failure on bare metal Kubernetes. I have a 4-node cluster which runs HA, 3 masters, 1 worker. I'm trying to test NIC failure on a node. Estimate error if down these.
Is there anything that marks the node as not ready if it hasn't checked in with a status update after a certain period of time?
The node lifecycle
controller,
it looks at the last heartbeat or the lease, because there is a lease feature, new one. I don't know the stage of it.
It's usually 10 minutes. Ask them if they waited 10 minutes.
It depends on how controller manager is configured, really. and if it's running at all.
Yeah, so but this person didn't say how long they waited, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I bet they
assign it
just-
to me.
Yeah, I bet they
Assign
just
it to
didn't
me.
wait a minute.
Assign it to me. I can go on talk to them.
Thank you. As a reminder for everybody watching, while we're assigning to some of the regulars to go and actually like address these issues, many of these issues, what we need is somebody to volunteer for triage, which is, ask questions to figure out if this is real or not go solve the problems. So please don't hesitate to volunteer.
Yeah, you can round robin me and Tim for one of them.
You got it. Just speak up when you see one that looks tasty. IPv4 Kubernetes pod mount volume fail. There's his pod trying to connect. OpenStack IPv6.
I can follow up with this person because it seems a complex environment. So
Yeah. Expose IP camera as service in Edge node. All right, what is this? One master and 3 workers. Either outside the cluster or other nodes.
This looks like fun. I'll have it.
It's IPVS also.
I'm in between projects with a bit of free time, so
I'm gonna fix that for you though. I saw your pings.
yeah.
Can you add the IPVS label on that while you're at it?
Come on, computer. There we go. Node IPAM allocate overlapping pod CIDR when increase node CIDR mask size.
I assigned this to you, Tim, because the guy wants to modify the behavior so he's able to resize the node CIDRs.
Yeah, we don't.
I don't know
really...
if it's a big change.
that
He submitted a pull request, and well, I don't know.
All right, I'll leave this one assigned to me, and I'll take a look at it. The truth is, the CIDR allocator is pretty dumb, and it assumes that all the CIDRs are the same size. We could make it smarter. All right, reduced cost for Kubernetes node. This is a feature request, huh?
It's not a network issue, is it?
Yeah, I'm not sure why this is a SIG network or actually a GitHub issue at all.
Looks like they just tag bombed.
You guys all hear my kids singing? Let me go shut the door. Give me 1 second. The joys of working at home in perpetuity. All right, I'll wait for time. Just 2 or 3 more?
Yep.
Additional 1 second latency in host service IP pod when upgrading from 115 to 118 on RHEL. IPVS mode. That's a big upgrade jump from 15 to 18.
Are they changing the rel version at the same time, or is it 115 to 118 on rel 1 or 8.1 for both of them?
Good question. Does not say.
Also, is it IP
That's a
tables
huge,
or IPVS?
that's a huge latency in any case.
Yeah, for sure.
IPVS.
IPVS?
Yeah, it's clearly wrong.
Yeah.
The question is, in that upgrade, what a million things could have gone wrong. Like I said in a previous conversation, I think this week, Mike, we don't really test that sort of a jump.
Indeed.
The second paragraph has additional details.
Dropped and retransmitted. Oh.
Huh.
I was pretty sure we had a patch in, I forgot what version, but there's a version where we disabled IPVS's connection reuse mode, which was associated with a 1 second latency that a lot of users were seeing. So it seems related.
Do you want to take it?
I'm not sure how that random, sure.
We introduced that random fully because of also because of packets being dropped, if I recall correctly.
That's right. It's a workaround for a kernel bug, which is fixed in 5.0, I think, kernel. So we can, yeah. I'll assign it to you, Andrew. If you can.
Does
Sorry?
RHEL 8.1 have the kernel 5.0?
No, it's got a 4x kernel, but most of the network stack is backported from later kernels. So it may, RHEL 8.2 may well have that fix, but if there is a link to a kernel patch in there, then we can try to get that backported to RHEL potentially.
I think when we added the random fully, there wasn't a kernel patch, so you won't find a link there.
Okay. Well, Andrew, if you're debugging, if you know what kernel patch caused it, just add that to the bug, and then we can do some more research and figure out if a later version of RHEL has that patch already or not.
Right. It may be, without reading all the comments, it's hard to tell, but maybe, if they remove random fully and the problem goes away completely, then interesting, and it's probably not an IPVS problem, and we'll have to look at that then.
Yeah, if taking that out removes it, that's, yeah.
Time
Right,
check, maybe one more? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the last one.
Last one. Default bandwidth burst is too large. Oh, this is about the bandwidth limiting.
I'll take this if you want. If nobody else wants, I mean, I think it's the last
Is that
one.
Jay?
Yeah.
Check that this has a pull request, and Tim, you rejected a similar pull request to add annotations for the burst or one of these annotations.
Yeah, I mean, annotations are a really crappy API.
It kind of seems like one of these days we should better standardize the bandwidth annotations instead of leaving them as random annotations that are alpha.
I mean, I wanted to kill them, and then everybody wanted to kill me for wanting to kill them. So, yes, I agree. We need to do better than this. We need to find bandwidth to tackle such an issue. All right, I'm going to stick that one on Jay. See if you can make heads or tails of it and come back. Oh, this one doesn't even have, this is just open as a bug. Interesting. Wonder how I clicked on it. All right, well, see what you can figure out. Obviously, we've got a little bit more. These ones are still fresh. This was 8 days ago. So this was a not so great 2-week cycle where we did not get through the whole triage for 2 weeks. Anybody's got free time after this meeting, there are some issues open.
Well, that said, we have a fairly light agenda, so maybe we can get back to the triage after we're done.
All right, I will stop sharing right now. You have the floor.
Thank you, Tim. I think it's Javier up next.
Hello. Yeah, so we have this, I opened this issue about defining like the FQDN as the kernel hostname field. Like today, like Kubernetes only sets the, only set the, like the short name as a kernel hostname. That's kind of like the standard for things like Debian, etc. But like Red Hat typically recommends like the FQDN, at least traditionally. I'm not sure these days. So it's at Two Sigma, like I work at Two Sigma, it's part of the Kubernetes team. We had several clusters, and for a few years now, we have a hack on Kubernetes source code where we set the FQDN as the kernel hostname, because that's what we do in all our systems. So as we move towards public cloud and GKE, like it would be great if we can keep this. Like I think this feature is more about interoperability, especially with old software that has been developed like years ago in traditional systems, not thinking about service architecture or like Kubernetes kind of way of exposing things as a service and not caring so much about pods, which is kind of like a recent model, right? Yeah, so it's mostly like wanting to get feedback from you guys, what you think about this feature, like chances that this is going to fly, and like how we can approach it to code it. Like Tim already mentioned that it's probably better. Like today, that's another thing. Today we do this as a patch to the kubelet. That was for us the easiest way to do it, and also to enforce it to everybody, because before there was no like the admission webhooks, right? That will allow us to block it out of 3. But like Tim suggested, that probably is better to do it like as a pod spec, because that's more flexible and it's better for I guess more like it's better to maintain, right? Easy to maintain. So I'm open to change my implementation to that. That's not an issue. If we do that, I probably need to talk to other SIGs as well, I guess, right?
Yeah. Javier, I really don't have a view on the change. I think it's okay. All I want to bring your attention on to is the Windows part of the story. So it might be a good idea to share this cap with Windows and get people to actually comment on this is breaking or non-breaking on their side, because I think it might be different over there.
I had the same question too, and I was also going to suggest doing a cap, since it seems like there's probably more discussion here than a bug report or a PR should have.
Yeah, so definitely. I wanted to do a kept, but I wanted to first agree on the approach. Like, for example, my kept wouldn't have been approved. Like, I think it's better to do it like Tim is suggesting as a pod field. So I wanted to first get, and then I will do a, I don't know, whatever you guys think. But yeah, definitely I do.
I thought it was worth discussing with the group, because it's an interesting change, because it's not exactly safe, right? Because for the context, the kernel's host name field is only 64 bytes long, and the 63 bytes is the same limit for pod name, namespace name, and service name. So it's possible to craft names that overflow that 64 byte kernel limit. And the failure mode is kind of ugly, right? Like pods will just fail to create because you can't set their host name.
They stay in container creating forever.
Yeah, but to fix it properly is enormously complicated, because it crosses all the different layers of workload deployment. Anything that might modify the name of a pod might get, add or subtract from that total 64 bytes. So I was initially personally very down on this, because it's just not, there's no safe way to do it. But on talking to folks and thinking about it more, it's one of these, like, people are doing this, and meeting people where they are and not asking them to rewrite their software is kind of what we're trying to do. But I didn't feel equipped to sort of unilaterally make an advice on this, so I thought I would bring it to the group. Anyone pro, con?
Are you suggesting, Tim, like an admission plugin to control the size is not a great idea because make a lot of assumptions?
No, I mean, we could do an admission control to change the size, but it's just going to fail again further down the stack, right?
Well, ideally, like the best
Right.
scenario is that it fails at creation, right? When I do qctl create deployment, does or replace that the place that is easier to fail and the user will notice immediately, right? That's how we have today a mission webhook controller at Tusima, and that seems to work very well. Like,
yes, so you'd have to do it. The problem is there's an arbitrary number of top-level workload controllers, right? Like there are workload controllers that wrap deployment, and there are workloads that just use replica set and bypass deployment. And so, like, in the limit, you have to fix all of those to understand all of the layers below them, and to consider the size of the namespace name that you're being written into, and to consider the size of the cluster suffix that you're using, right? So this is what I mean. Like, I guess I said it wrong. It's not impossible to solve. It's just a really interesting layering problem.
Keep in mind that the failure is not the user error. Like, I created something and it failed because something in the system doesn't work.
Right. But you can set up organizational rules that say, look, if you're creating a deployment, you're only allowed to have 9 characters and that's it.
So is there a way to make pods fail? I couldn't figure out by playing with this how to make pod go into error or container config error when this limit is hit. It seems that it just keep retrying because it fails to create a pod sandbox.
Yep, that's the failure mode right now. There is no way to hard fail pod sandbox creation. Kubelet just keeps trying. I mean, it'll back off, and so it won't just keep trying, over and over and over again. But
so what if we let pod sandbox go without failing it and then fail at the container creation layer? Is that safe for all kind of environments or just Linux?
I don't know the answer to that.
That seems tricky.
Yeah,
it seems like
to do that too.
A better fix might be to actually teach Kubelet about sort of durable failures and ephemeral failures, and for it to say, look, I can't set the host name now. I'm never going to be able to set it. I'm not going to bother.
Exactly, like no retriable failures, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we can talk about this here, but we'll also need to talk to SIG and see what they think about that.
I mean, it also has impact on network plugins, because network plugins might be able to say, as a result of sandbox creation, that they have a hard failure, and so don't even bother retrying. It seems like this has broader application.
Oh, the general non-retriable, yes.
Yeah, like adding some kind of error types to pod sandbox creation.
Sure, but let's not get too conflated between the issues.
Yes.
One is if we added a field to pod spec that set host name to the FQDN, how does SIG Network feel about that, and how does SIG Node feel about that? And then can we do better with the error reporting?
Yeah, for sure.
So do we need other SIGs like IPA machinery or SIG apps for this also? Or
no, you'll need Node. Probably
only Node. Okay.
It might be interesting to see what apps thinks about this as owners of deployment and replica set and stateful set. They might be interested to think about the failure modes, but I think that ultimately the decision sits between SIG Network and SIG Node, and probably leans towards SIG Node.
So SIG Node owns the pod?
Yeah, SIG Node's own pods.
Okay.
Anybody have significant objections or want to +1 the proposal? Anybody heard this from their customers?
I like, as I said, Windows, and now that I think of it, what will happen to people who are deploying things with long name, like charts? There are plenty of charts out there with a very significantly long name. We just need to think about these things.
Is there like a Windows special SIG or like people that we can track?
There's SIG Windows out there.
Okay, I can drop by also trying to see what they think. Yeah. I can also ask internally in my company, like our Windows people, what they do with FQDNs and stuff, because probably either they do a hack or they set the FQDN to hostname, because that's kind of the standard here.
I have no idea what you do. So
Yeah, I know. So I was trying to find like there was some discussion I had with somebody from the Kerberos team that was trying to, and I mentioned something about window in their discussion. So anyway, so yeah, I can drop by Windows definitely to understand what they think.
Okay, so Windows will be interesting just from a perspective point of view. SIG node ultimately they own the pod spec, and so they'll have to decide whether this is an acceptable weirdness, the failure mode, and then maybe if there's better ways to fail. All right, well, the issue is open. I breezed through it when we were doing triage, so if anybody else here on SIGNet wants to go read it or weigh in on it or think about it, please do. All right, well, so you got pretty decent response here, which is nobody's against it.
Yeah, that's a win on my book. So like yeah, so I guess like the one question I had, like the pod sandbox and it seems to be like different systems use different underlying runtime. So
yep,
like I don't know if you had time to check the PR that they have with the kubelet, because the change to the sandbox and the runtime will be the same regardless how we pass the variable there. But I don't know if there are places that I missed that I may need to extend more, or we can discuss when I have a new approach.
yeah, you'll have to. I don't know that code very well anymore, so that'll have to be a SIG node question.
All right, sounds good.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Jeremy, you want to talk to us about multi-cluster services?
Yeah, so I came, I think, a couple months ago now to kind of drop the multi-cluster services kit, but basically in SIG multi-cluster, we've been working on extending the service concept across clusters, and it's kind of evolved, and a bunch of people here have commented on that PR for that KEP. Really appreciate all the input. But I think where we're getting to now is like actually figuring out the real implementation. So we've got a demo set up right now where we have basically a forked kube proxy that runs alongside regular kube proxy, and it just handles multi-cluster services that have been imported into a cluster, which functions but doesn't seem like a great way forward. You basically have these two separate kube proxies that are fighting over IP tables, and it seems kind of hairy. And I think we also want to be able to build more on top of this multi-cluster services concept. So, you know, as that grows, the interactions will get worse and worse. So I wanted to come kind of get thoughts on what we can do that's better than that. And so I put together a doc that I linked from the notes here, and I can share, or we can just talk it out. I cannot share, so.
Let me see if I can find the sharing setting for that. You should be able to now, I think.
Okay, yeah, awesome. So yeah, our kind of take was that the idea of having a perma-forked kube proxy that needs to do all the things kube proxy does is probably not good. So with that said, you know, looking at kube proxy, basically internally, multi-cluster services is designed to feel and act as much as possible like regular cluster local services. So the concepts really map well to basically the existing kube proxy implementation, where there is basically there's two structs that we care about before programming IPVS, IP tables, what have you, and it's the proxy.service port and the proxy.endpoint. So the thinking is, if we could make it easier to plumb the service import, which is basically the multi-cluster service, into a service port, and it still uses endpoint slices, we could take advantage of all the work that's already been done in kube proxy, and these things would just work nicely together. So here are some ideas with some personal preferences that aren't really spelled out here for ways we could go about doing it. And I just kind of wanted to get everybody's input and see if we can start kind of steering in a direction. Because one thing we all kind of agreed is that SIG Network needs to, SIG Network should probably be in charge of this decision. So the basic ideas are in-tree support. So this service import, this multi-cluster service import just becomes a new core API proto basically. And that'll work. It's really easy to think about, but it doesn't really move in the direction that I think Kubernetes wants to go, which is these kinds of add-ons supported by a CRD. So the other option is a CRD where kubeproxy basically watches for the CRD, and if it gets created, multi-cluster services work. Taking it further and definitely more effort is, what if kubeproxy had some kind of external API like a gRPC extension or something that let you hook up other feeds? This of course means designing yet another API just to support the first API. So this is probably not the direction you necessarily want to go, but I want to throw it out there. And then kind of an even bigger step would be, there is already kind of an extensible service discovery API out there in the form of XDS. So what if we followed suit with Envoy and kubeproxy could actually consume XDS? Of course, this is another big idea. So these are just some ideas as conversation starters, but kind of want to get input here.
I haven't read the proposal in detail, but could you explain how endpoints work there?
So endpoints, so endpoints would basically just, we'd probably make it work just like endpoint slice. We're really targeting Kubernetes with endpoint slice support though. So endpoint slice is the target. I'm not sure what we, so do you just want to understand like how endpoint slice maps to service import, or?
Yeah, sir. How are endpoints from the other clusters part of any of this, or like how is kubeproxy supposed to figure out what to do with the service once we have it?
Yeah, so the kind of high level view of the implementation is that some multi-cluster service controller, which is an implementation specific thing that we expect there will be a few of, will look at clusters and basically watch all the clusters in some registry, which we are also not really defining. There's a new service export resource that is name mapped to a service, and when that gets created, we consider that service exported. And then that controller basically looks at all the exported services, grabs their endpoint slices, and essentially copies them into importing clusters as a service import with endpoint slices that map to the service import with some multi-cluster / service name annotation or label, like basically the same way that endpoint slices map to service.
Okay. Does that assume that there's direct connectivity between pods and the clusters?
Yes, it does. So a flat network is a requirement. So either deploying somewhere with a flat network, like in the same VPC, or deploying with something that can flatten the network for you.
Okay.
And
Jeremy,
that'll have to be addressed at some point.
Yeah.
I have one question, Jeremy. When you import one service, is the service available for all the cluster or only going to be available for the kubeproxy?
It will be available within the clusters via kubeproxy, within all of the importing clusters. Now, I think there's still some kind of open questions of whether every cluster imports the service or some are allowed to not. But yeah, it would be available within the services, basically like a cluster IP. Only we've been calling it supercluster IP.
Yeah, my question is why if it's a service in the cluster, why kubeproxy cannot consume directly as a service?
Oh, so it isn't. So we want to differentiate between regular in-cluster services and supercluster services. The idea being that you can still actually access, like if you're an exporting cluster, you can talk to a supercluster service, which might have backends in multiple clusters, but you can still talk to your cluster local service, which is just within your own cluster. But it also means that we don't run the risk of accidentally changing existing service behavior because somebody else exports the service.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure I understand that answer. Would it suffice to simply add some labels or fields to the existing services rather than introduce new kinds of services?
So I guess the thing here is too many things currently interact with service. So the thinking was that it would be safer to have a new resource than try to say services with this label should be treated differently. Like services with this label should also have be exposed at the multi-cluster level. And then the service name is important too. So if we wanted to preserve the original service's name, we'd have to, maybe we have some well-known pattern that's like multi-cluster dash service name that we create a duplicate service, but it all seems to start getting messy because too many things actually are aware of service today, whereas a new resource means that it's entirely opt-in. And in the case of like a CRD, you don't even have to install it.
If I may, it looks to me like what you're trying to do is to get proxy to say, okay, I have a service with X number of backends in my current cluster plus X number of backends outside the cluster. That's really what
yeah, but there may be no backends in your current cluster.
Yeah, that's fine. So we're not really looking at services, we're looking at how endpoint are modeled. Because kubeproxy doesn't really care if that endpoint points local or outside, it just deals with it, and that's it, that across all the implementation. Yeah. So if we figure out a way where we can model the endpoint in a certain way that says, okay, this endpoint is from external provider, that way endpoint slice and endpoint and the endpoint controller may like ignore it, sort of it. If it exists, I'll just have it, and then that will solve all your problem. It doesn't need any new API. It doesn't need any new API for the sake of data path. It may need the API for the sake of control plane paths like the controller and so on. But the realization of it doesn't require any change.
I mean, also service affinity, we have some of that, and we have topology. Maybe some of those could play in here to say that prefer a service in your local or a backend in your local cluster before you go outside of the cluster. Just a thought.
So first of all, my understanding is like service topology is kind of up in the air right now.
Yes, it is.
Like everything else.
Yeah, but also like so that would mean that if you had another, so if we built on service and we did a like just extend existing services model, so that there can be backends in other clusters as well, that would mean that you'd need to, I mean, I think it seems like there's a big risk of just kind of accidentally changing existing services without anyone opting into this new behavior.
Sure, but so what about what Carl said though? I think what he's saying is, go ahead and introduce a new kind of service, but leverage the existing endpoints objects.
Yeah, we are looking at using the existing endpoint objects. We're just looking at a service import instead of a service, but the endpoint slices are the same.
So I guess I was thinking about it a different way. Can you implement this today by manually controlling what the endpoints are for a service?
So
just as a thought experiment.
Yeah. So first of all, there's a KEP on this that I would actually encourage everybody to go read. It's a really good KEP. The thing that I think gets weird when you start to like shoehorn this into services is all of these cluster.local names are no longer local to your cluster, which to me immediately like sends up a flare.
Back up. That was the question I wanted to ask. We've been talking about kubeproxy, but what about the DNS? What's the DNS part of this?
So the DNS story is that instead of cluster.local, it would be something like supercluster.local, but named to be determined. But yeah, it would be a new name for the service, for the supercluster service, completely separate from cluster.local.
The question.
So if you access, sorry, Cal, go.
No, it's fine. Go.
The distinction then was if you access foo.cluster.local, you're going to get the foo that's in your cluster, and if you access foo.supercluster, then you're going to get access to the entire the group of clusters, and then it's opt-in at the client side.
Right. So getting back to what Carl said, I think, is it true that the kubeproxy doesn't just look at endpoints, it also looks at service. So it's not enough to just stuff things into endpoints.
Right.
Okay, but is this a pretty small matter then? We introduce a new service object, the super cluster service object, let the kube proxy opt into it as a way to hint it to look at the right endpoints. And
yeah, exactly. So that would be the CRD approach, is that we have this, we've been calling it service import, but we have this new CRD that kube proxy can watch, and it maps to existing endpoints, like the same endpoint slice struck, but basically there's another way to pick up this service ports. From
that sounds like a pretty small change.
Sorry, there's a collision.
Oh, you're breaking up.
Oh man. Is it okay now?
Yes.
Yeah, the JavaScript JIT needs to catch up. Yeah, I think some of this is like a software engineering and maybe versioning issue, because kube proxy is in core, and then the service export is going to be, at least right now, it's evolving outside of core. And what happens if you're trying to pull the CRD into the core with the kube proxy? How do we manage that if you wanted to teach it about other types other than the core type?
So this isn't the first time we've crossed this. Storage has dealt with this too, and so we should consider these things in independent decisions of should it be a built-in or a CRD versus should the CRD live in the core or out of the core. I will say that I think the likelihood of getting a new in-tree type is very, very low. We've, putting my other SIG Arch hat on, we're asking everybody who's bringing up new types, why can't you do this as a CRD? This seems like a great candidate for being a CRD as opposed to a regular type.
Right. Multi-cluster is definitely not something you need for every single cluster. So having a CRD makes sense. You can opt in easily. We have the mechanism that kube proxy could watch CRDs and just basically turn the feature on when you install the service import CRD. Yeah, I don't think it's actually a big change. In fact, I've done a very hacky prototype of it, and we have a demo that's basically doing that up now.
I want to go back to the DNS point that you guys make. Cluster.local does not mean local to the cluster. It's a name. It doesn't really mean that it's local to the cluster. It can be foo, it can be anything. The fact that people use cluster.local doesn't mean it's meant to be local, right?
I mean, in theory, the name can be changed, and lots of customers do change the name, but an order of magnitude or two more customers don't change the name. And I find it personally very odd to say that foo.cluster.local accesses things that are not local to my cluster. Principle of least surprise to me is violated.
Isn't that the concept of headless without selector, right?
Yes, but then at least you manually did that.
Yeah.
Somebody made that decision.
So the point I was trying to make earlier is, it's as a consumer, as a client, right? I'm a pod that I just want to go to a service endpoint and I'm done, right? Do I really need to worry about internal or external, or just I need to worry about the name that somebody assigned to me to call and I'm done? The fact that this name lives inside or outside the cluster is somebody else's business.
Yeah, I mean, you might have different characteristics of traffic to and from the other clusters. It might be slower, it might be higher latency. The pod might care about that, though.
And I think you can assume, for the sake of argument now, that the cost metric for an external pod is not significantly different than an internal pod. We're going to have to deal with the reality where that is not true, right? We'll have to deal with gatewayed island clusters and crossing over between segments and those sorts of things. And we will need some sort of topology support if we're going to allow multiple clusters across regions, right? You don't want to go to your Australia cluster from your US cluster just because it happened to be there. So, we're going to need something to fix topology there. But I think for now, we're making an assumption that let's just assume you've got multiple clusters in the same region and the cost metric is one.
So back on the topic then about clients, just wanting to get to a service. How many clients actually have hard-coded cluster.local in it, right? Don't clients usually say, give me a domain name and I'll open a connection to it? and it's
Correct.
some higher level thing's problem to say what the service name is, what the domain name is.
Yes.
So it seems to me like it should not be a problem to say, okay, we've got some names, some domain names that are really, in plain English, cluster local, and some are regional. And the higher level thing that is choosing what domain name to feed into a pod or whatever, is responsible for making that decision appropriately.
Yeah,
I agree.
exactly. That's kind of the thinking, is that when you're ready to adopt the multi-cluster service, whatever you're doing that manages your config would just start supplying the supercluster name instead of the cluster local.
Is there a problem with having endpoint slice objects that do not have a service object associated with them?
No, there is not, and that is an awesome thing. Endpoint slice is pretty cool like this. Yeah, and so we can just basically take the name, and we've got a prototype of this working already, where basically we just have a different label for the service imports, and they get associated with the service import services instead of the regular services.
So I don't know how much more time we want to spend on this topic. I think a new plugin API I'm pretty down on. Looking at your sheet here, I'm pretty not in favor of adding a new RPC-ish or exec-ish sort of API underneath kubeproxy. That would be the truly extensible way to go here. I just don't think the value is commensurate to the work.
Yeah, well, and also it's building a whole new API to unblock another API. I agree. Yes. Like that's if that needs to happen at some point, that should be separate.
Yeah, history shows here that the building of these new plugin APIs like CRI or device plugins take months and months and months, and so I don't think we want to deal with that. The XDS, I think, is an interesting proposition. It's pretty wildly different. I don't know. It may warrant its own hour-long discussion on SIGNet. Like, what if we taught kubeproxy to consume XDS? I don't know how familiar everybody else is with XDS. It's the RPC protocol that Envoy Proxy introduced for consuming endpoints from a controller. So it's actually squarely targeted at this problem. It's not as general purpose as endpoint slice is, but it also carries a bunch of other information that kubeproxy doesn't need to know about.
And they are scrapping it and starting over, if I remember correctly.
Are they?
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah,
okay.
There were tweets yesterday or the day before about, hey, we think we didn't get it very correct, so we're going to start over, something like that.
Cool.
Yeah.
So maybe now's the time for us to get in with them and unify.
So how are other multi-cluster approaches fitting with this proposal? Like, is there any actually active multi-cluster effort going on with Kubernetes?
Yeah, I think there's a few actually. In SIG multi-cluster, we've had some good involvement. Looks like Submariner is working on support for this API and looking at how it could fit in as well, for example.
I am surprised that you went with pod IPs across clusters though, because in my own experience, that's not going to be deployable in a lot of places. Like flat networks are not easy to come by.
Right. So
we're going to deal with non-flat networks. That has to be dealt with.
Yeah.
Pod IP was the easy one to approach first, and I think it satisfies like the Submariner sort of approach, and self-servingly, like within a Google Cloud, I can give you multiple clusters. There's a CEP, Cal. I would encourage you to go read and feedback on the CEP. It's under SIG multi-cluster, which is probably why you didn't see it.
I linked the issue in the notes, and everything's linked from there. But yeah, please take a look. Feedback would be definitely appreciated.
Okay, I'll read. Thank you.
So my lean on this would be CRD, and then we can figure out whether that CRD needs to live in the tree or whether we can actually consume it from out of tree, there is some prior art there that we can go look at.
Are we breaking any kind of seals open with adding support for CRDs to kube proxy?
Great question. Precedents are strong. Will there be a slippery slope here? Like, is there a pressure backlog of things, crazy things people want to do in kube proxy that they haven't because they've been afraid to ask, and suddenly we're going to open the deluge?
I feel like things we've already added to kube proxy might have been better done as CRDs, but
that's probably true.
You know what I want to do? Go to the API folks and just try to get them to have a thing that loads CRDs from a certain resource, from a certain source once the cluster boot up, and that ensures that even though the cluster might not be installed with the CRD, I can at least ensure that it's loaded. But that's a different story and different discussion.
That is a different story. Actually, I think I got assigned that bug from SIGArch and I dropped it. But in this case, I don't even think it needs to be loaded. I think like if kube proxy just added a watch on custom resources, then if it's not present, if we don't find a CRD that satisfies this kind, then we don't need to, we can just skip that path. And if we do find it, then we install a watch on that resource.
Right. This way you can lazy enable it if you want, but there's, yeah, you don't have to think about it at deployment time.
I'm a little bit afraid of the kube proxy work that would need to be done to make the watches happen at a time other than startup. But actually, maybe it's okay to just like when you detect that it changed, you just like explode and restart and catch it the next time around.
Yeah. Yeah, we'd have to look at the impact on that. But so does that sound like a good place to start for everybody though? Just like
I think that's where I would start. Who you should talk to is the storage folks who like Saad and Michelle, who have some prior art here around CRDs. I forget exactly what the ultimate conclusion was, but they might be a good place to get some context.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll reach out for sure.
I just pasted the cap in the chat. I just happened to have it up.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Sounds like you managed to strike exactly the right chord here to get some interest. So
yeah.
Cool. So that actually brings us right up. What was that, Tim?
I guess no more triage.
Nope.
No, it seems not. We had a short agenda, but not a small one. In that case, I think we should close up and see each other in 2 weeks, but we can all do some triage individually in that time.
Yes, please, I implore everybody, please go take some look at triage, and if you've been assigned issues, please go and work on those and ping them. I'm going to run through from the back, and I'll try to close out some ones that have been idle for more than a month. But there are some new ones in the last 2 weeks that we didn't get to today.
See everybody next time.
Thanks.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.